I'm psychologist Dr. Bryan Violette, and today's guest is Dr. Phillip Scrofani. He's a master clinician, my former supervisor, and what I believe to be a model of Catholic integration with psychology. We'll be unpacking some of the quotes that I still use today to train my students, and also talking about how he has navigated cancer in the face of death. This is the Catholic Center Show. I'm here with Dr. Phillip Scrofani, a legend in clinical circles. I'm very honored to have you with me today. Dr. Scrofani is just retired, was a professor for a long time at DMU. You're about to say something. Did you not just retire?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. So you just retired after a long time, after what, roughly 50 years in clinical work and in teaching at the graduate level?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. You trained me personally during my doctoral program at DMU. We were just reflecting on that being 9 years ago when I actually graduated, but I was seeing clients all throughout the program. So it took me a long time to get through the programs, about I think it was 7 years start to finish. So I've been clinician for about 15 years, but you were very instrumental in my training. How are you?
I am doing fine. As I indicated before, I entered my 80th year, but I'm still very spry and very fortunate and very active, doing things like flying planes and keeping fit.
That's so great.
Not quite what I used to be, but
Yeah.
probably doing pretty well for my age. And still looking forward to growing in the field, believe it or not, and contributing in some way. I am embarking on a project with Dr. Nordling and Dr. Titus. I don't know if you've ever met Dr. Titus, because
Briefly, yeah.
he was a theologian before you came, and then came back later. Anyway, Dr. Nordling and Dr. Titus and Dr. Vitz did the model book. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's the
meta model, yeah.
The meta model. And now they're looking to do the second version of that. And I've been saying for years, it's a wonderful compilation of the intellectual bank of knowledge that comes from Catholic theology and philosophy, and how it might be integrated with our understanding of the science of psychology. But now, how does it apply? What does it look like when you're using it with patients? And I think that's maybe one of my strengths. And so they want me on board so that we can write about the application of case conceptualization with the model and intervention, things like that. So we'll see how we do.
Yeah, no, I think that'll be really helpful. And that's something that Dr. Greg Bottaro and also Dr. Gerard McNicholas, whom you also know, works with us at CatholicPsych. That's something that we try and focus on with our model, is taking the heady intellectual didactic stuff and training people in sort of applied clinical work. So we're inspired by that too.
Well, I'm very excited about what the three of you are doing, because I've caught glimpses here and there, and I've often thought that's exactly what we're hoping for, that the next generation kind of makes this come alive and enters it into the culture in some useful way. And I think you guys are doing that splendidly. I've really been so impressed. Of course, I remember Dr. Bottaro in his early days when he was studying with us. Was then following a religious life. Kind of a humorous story. I don't know if he remembers this, but when he was, I guess, his second year as a student, and he was wearing his garb, his Franciscan garb, and being squired by Father Groeschel, who I love dearly. And we were talking about football, and it was coming to the playoffs, and he was, of course, a Patriots fan. And he said, how do you think the playoffs are going to come out? So this was a wild guess. I said, well, I think it's going to go into overtime, and Vinatieri's going to come and kick a field goal, and they're going to win. And that's what happened.
Prophetic.
So he he came back the next week, and he kind of looked at me kind of funny, but he figured, well, lucky guess, you know. Well, I think it was the following year,
Yeah.
same situation. The Patriots got to the finals again. How will it come out? And I said, well, Vitteri's going to kick a field goal to win the game. And of course, it
Yeah.
happened again. And the
Yes.
second time, he kind of
Yes.
looked at me like, what's going on here? Of course, it was a wild guess both times. You know? But I left him in transcendent bliss for a bit. You
There you go. There you go. That's
know?
great. Well, I wanted to talk to you today largely about struggle in life. And I mentioned that your name is legendary among our training experience because I quote you quite frequently. So today I want to begin by offering you 3 quotes that you probably don't remember saying,
Mhm.
and I'm hoping this will be interesting for you to hear yourself repeated back to you, and maybe give you some space to unpack it if you can. These
Right?
quotes, okay. So the first quote: "We're sitting in your classroom, and we were talking about how hard clinical work is, how demanding it is, and how much of yourself you need to bring to each therapeutic relationship, each dynamic. And of course, what the model that you trained me in primarily is an interpersonal model. So that really requires you to bring yourself. It's not just a system of techniques where you're distant from the client or the patient. You have to care. You have to really mean it. And I remember asking you in the class. I said, "How often is this job rewarding?"
Mhm.
And your response was, "As often as you need it to be."
Mhm. Okay. Uh, well, I don't remember that exact response. I guess I can speak to it though. I
Yeah.
think I think that a couple of things are in play here. One is that yes, indeed, our relationship with our clients is not an intellectual one; it's a personal one.
Yeah.
It can't be otherwise, and that means that what goes on with the client uh, is something then starts to go on with you because you're relating in a very personal way to the client. Another
Yes.
way of looking at that is you're taking on through compassion, you're taking on their suffering, you're taking on their struggle, and that's important because I think as Christians we have to be with. We can't just be there in an intellectual way. We have to be with the client and share their struggles. How
Yes.
is that rewarding? It's rewarding when you begin to see that out of that struggle, number one, the client perceives that, first of all, you care about them and you're willing to shoulder this burden with them.
Yeah.
But also, secondly, that if someone else can understand their struggle, then maybe there's hope
Hmm.
that they can kind of unravel it themselves. And of course, that's what you do with them. Um, uh, now, how is that helpful to you? It's helpful to see the fact that you're helping someone else. I think we're made for that. That's what John Paul II was talking about when he talked
Yes.
about self gift. It's all about
Yes.
self gift.
Yes.
And every time you attend to that and realize, hey, um, uh, I have an opportunity to give to someone in
Yeah.
an unselfish way, uh, that kind of makes you happy. Or at least it always made me kind of happy.
Yeah. Yeah. I took it on in 2 different ways upon hearing it. The first was part of the training of an interpersonal model, which was that sometimes change happens as a result of mere presence, and it's almost as if change happens under the hood. It's not essentially the content of what you're sharing, but the process and the dynamic of what's going on between you and the client, and therefore it becomes rewarding when you see change in a manner that's unpredictable, right? It's not as measurable as symptom reduction via a CBT type of protocol,
Right.
right? So that's the one way I took it. The other way I took it was on a spiritual level, which was that this is hard for us as clinicians. So how often is it going to be rewarding Well, God allows it to be rewarding for me as often as I need to keep going because this is my call. You know, and our own, and that's the often the trajectory of our spiritual lives, right? We go through these periods of desolation and consolation. We can't predict it, but the way he gently walks with us and accompanies us,
Mhm.
he brings us along based on what he knows we need at a given moment.
Mhm.
So when I heard you say that, it was like, oh,
Oh,
I guess I just have to trust God.
well, I think your interpretation is as good as, or if not better than mine. But I think there's so much truth in what you're saying that he
Yeah.
knows what we need, and somehow he gets it to us.
Yeah.
Especially, I think, when we're in the right place, which is our profession is all about self giving, uh,
Yes.
and and so uh, I it's interesting how you put that, because from time to time in my practice I've often shared, and I don't know if I've shared with you people in class at times, you feel the presence of God
Oh yeah.
sometimes when things are going well. That
Yes.
there's the grace you're receiving, this grace, and you
Yeah.
share it with the patients. I've heard patients say this. I feel I feel kind of buoyed up right now. There's something going on that's helpful.
Yeah.
Is it simply transference? Well, maybe to in part, but I think it's more
Yeah.
than that. I think
Yeah.
it's more than that.
Yeah. And I think also you have it, you can get a sense of it when things are happening outside of the direct therapeutic relationship that are supportive of the therapeutic relationship. You know, the priest on Sunday says something in his homily, which has direct import to something you lackadaisically said in a clinical session, right?
Right.
Or being like external changes, you just have a sense that he's the real therapist. It's
Uh,
much bigger than what's going on between you and the client directly.
yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely.
All right. So the next quote I have for you to unpack that you probably won't remember. We were talking about again struggle, and we're talking about difficult clients. We're talking about a set of personality defenses that are challenging for the clinician, especially in the early years when it's hard to not um, personalize what's happening between you and the client,
Mhm.
and you have the imposter syndrome. You have this insecurity about your skills, and when a client maybe attacks you or tries to de-skill you or push you away, or many of the ways in which we defend ourselves, we all do these kinds of things.
Mhm.
um, it's very challenging. It's very hard for you, and you take it personal rather than seeing it as reflective of their defenses.
Yeah.
And something you said about this was that you said, remember, as hard as it is to work with a client, it's a million times harder to be that client.
Ah,
They have to live interiorly with what you're dealing with during that small percentage of your life.
mhm. Yeah. You. It's sort of a backhanded privilege that you're experiencing in that moment, the agony that the
Yeah.
person is going through. And
Yes.
again, it goes back to the idea that you, in that moment, even though it's bothering you, and even though you might feel under attack and might
Yeah.
feel uh, de-skilled in the moment,
Yeah.
uh, that you're willing to bear that because you're helping the person to realize that, well, they're still valuable in spite of that uh,
Sure.
difficulty that they export. Uh, so there's that, and yeah. So having said that, one of the things that I think scares a lot of young therapists is the idea that, gee whiz, if I say the wrong thing, especially with a client like that who's challenging and dismissive and
Yeah.
not necessarily open to what anybody has to say to them, let alone you. Uh,
Yeah.
when you have a challenge like that and you have a rupture,
Yeah.
uh, the rupture is two-sided. That it's your nose is at a joint as well as the client's nose is at a joint. Is that
Yeah.
the end of the world, though? No, it's the
No.
beginning, actually, because
Yes.
what occurs in the rupture is in their real life. that
Yeah.
people tend to then give them wide berth. They don't want to have much to do with them because they're difficult. Whereas your job is to do something different. That's what
Yeah.
you get paid the big bucks for, to
Yeah.
find something different. And the thing that you do different is you hang in there with them in spite of
Yes.
the rupture, and you get
Yes.
over your own wounded ego.
Yeah.
And in the process, you get over, help them to get over theirs, help them to see, yes, you've pushed me away, but I'm not going to leave you because I know that you're still inherently valuable and there's an
Yeah.
inherent goodness within you that I'm still going to look for, I'm going to find.
Yeah. Yeah. There's, I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, but it's true that underneath all these defense mechanisms is that fear of abandonment. These abandonment fears are what drives so much of what we do. And if we don't abandon the client, if we say, as you say, hang in there, that provides a corrective experience, and which makes it difficult. And I think the more you learn how to repair, the less concerned you are with rupture.
Right,
You know,
exactly.
you know how to fix it. I tell people it's like the tango. Therapy is like the tango. You get tangled up and you just tango on. I stole that from Al Pacino in Scent of a Woman. Ain't no mistakes in the tango. Like, ain't no mistakes in life. So therapy's like that. Relationships are like that. They don't have to end because there's tension. There's real
Yeah,
love there. It's like insulated.
yeah,
Like the tension's insulated by the connection.
yeah. And so you're there to weather that. You're there to weather the storm
Yeah.
with them, and so that change can happen. Uh, Another thing that I teach that's puzzling, because everybody talks about counter-transference
Hmm.
like it's a bad thing, um,
You're right.
and in fact, at least there's at least one theory that began to realize that maybe counter-transference is very valuable in object
Mm.
relations theory.
Yeah.
They began to discover, well, the way you experience someone as disagreeable or as too frightening or as even possibly repulsive uh, is your experience is telling you something about their experience. And your task is, how do you get them to see their experience more deeply without further injury?
Yes.
And so countertransference, this willingness to be open
Yeah.
to their difficulties is incredibly valuable.
Yeah.
Nordling and I we got invited years ago to write an article on psychotherapy, actually.
Hmm.
Uh, I'm trying to remember the Edification. It was a special issue of the journal Edification.
Yeah.
And what we talk about in the writing is exactly that it's not just countertransference, it's true compassion
Mm.
to weather difficult interactions with someone. It's something
Yes.
that therapists do, and most people tend not to do unless you have a saintly friend who just has so much love in them that they can tolerate that. Most people will shy away from that,
Right.
but we don't. That's what we do.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can, and if we can help with curiosity, like explore their process of pushing us away. For example, we take one defense mechanism, then pushing us away, and help them see that they are not their defenses. Like separate that for them. Their defense, like align with them against their defense, and help them see this thing you're doing with me is
Yeah,
what you do with everybody.
yeah,
And this is not like it was adaptive maybe at one point, but now it's not helping you get your actual needs met, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
That's one of Yalom's dictums. Yeah, you had group with me, right, as
I
well,
did, yeah. Yeah.
and we looked at Yalom, and one of his great contributions was precisely
Hmm.
that in a group, a person begins. The wonderful thing about group, I don't know if you do groups. I used to love to do groups. I've done
Yeah, we do. Yep.
hundreds upon hundreds of groups,
Yep.
and group is truth. Because it's like Joe Louis said about the boxing ring. You can run, but you can't hide.
Yeah.
In group, you can't hide. Your true self is going to come out.
Yeah.
And Yalom talks about when your true self comes out, and you're too pushy or you're too uh, phobic about hurting people. Whatever it is that comes out, people are going to feed that back to you. And initially it's going to bruise. And so that's what the therapist is there for, to help you
Yeah.
contain that so that it doesn't bruise you so much. But
Yeah.
eventually what happens is, well, yeah, it's not so much me, it's when I do that that gets me in trouble. If I can
Yes.
only learn to do that differently,
Yeah.
maybe I am redeemable, you know.
Yeah.
He doesn't quite say it that way, but I put it in kind of in our language,
Yeah.
that we redeem ourselves by realizing that we're not necessarily programmed to do the things that don't work for us, that
Yeah.
there's a better way. Uh, the great thing about our advocation in all of this is that Christianity gives you a better way.
Yes.
The other, that's where many of the other psychological methods stop. They're wonderful methods. Thank heavens we have them, but they don't give you the virtues. They
Right.
don't give you these core things that kind of guide you to finding
Yeah.
a better way. You know,
Yeah.
and
And I think they I mean, even interpersonal theory, or we integrate parts theory. I was thinking about when you asked about us doing groups, we do a lot of groups with therapists, so their therapist parts emerge and everyone's trying to therapize one another rather than sort of bringing a core authentic experience. They have a part that like hijacks their presentation. But even going back to the what Christianity offers, true integration, I think, helps you see that what you're doing in your interpersonal dynamics, your projections, your assumptions about other people, well, you also do that with God. How much of your relationship, your spiritual relationship with God is bound up in your psychology, and how
yeah,
you assume that, you assume he's on a cloud throwing lightning bolts down at you every time you commit a venial sin. Like, that's not what he actually reveals to us about himself. We're probably talking about someone else, not God right now.
right, exactly.
Yeah.
God is more accepting than any human being will ever be. I had a priest friend who worked in a hospital environment with me many years ago. He, I was probably one of the first psychologists to legally run an inpatient unit, because they
Hmm.
didn't have enough psychiatrists in
Oh,
large
wow.
hospitals in those days. So, uh, in a sort of a unusual way, I wound up as I was a unit psychologist, and the poor psychiatrist had a nervous breakdown and had to leave suddenly. And the next day, the clinical director said, "You're in charge. You're taking these units." And I said, "I'm a psychologist. I can't do medications." He said, "Yeah, but you know how to deal with people. I'll get an internist to come over and take care of the medications." And so, and so I befriended the chaplain, who happened to be a Catholic priest. They weren't always Catholic priests. Sometimes they were Protestant ministers. In this case, I would take walks with him and we would talk, because I had undergraduate training as a Thomist. And so we would have these deep conversations.
Yeah.
And at one point, like most, neophytes, I did something bureaucratically unacceptable that I didn't realize. It was naivete, and I got
Yeah.
called on the carpet.
Hmm.
And he said to me, the priest. So I was pretty shook up. I was a young psychologist, and I'm
Hmm.
walking with him, and he's nurturing me, and he says, "One thing you need to remember is God always forgives, but the bureaucracy never forgives." And what it brought home is, no matter what you do, God's going to forgive you, but human beings will not be so kind to each other, as we see in
That,
the news today.
yeah.
Everybody's
Yes.
trying to shoot everybody else down.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate. Uh,
That's funny. Yeah. So just going back to the quote, so the way I took that quote was, I think that was just a strong basis for empathy for me, to get out of my own head, get out of my own insecurities, get out of my own, my own parts that are angry in response, my own, I mean, counter-transference. I mean, that's the other thing about counter-transference. I think it's an invitation to look at our own unresolved issues, right? And our own history, and how it's playing out between us and the client. But that line helped me see, like, I wasn't even seeing the client. I was only thinking about myself, but just thinking about how hard it is to be them. and how much they treat themselves in the introject, right?
Yeah.
The introject, the way they're treating me, but all the time, it just kind of like softened me and
Yeah.
like broke me down to just feel compassion for them. So that's why I love that quote.
Well, great. I think you're proof positive that I think students exceed their professors at times because they take things further. Professor says something basic, and I'm always surprised at how the student, like you're doing, and I think in this case,
Yeah.
takes it further and makes it even better. I think that's the whole process of handing off to each other,
Yeah.
and I think that you and Greg and your other colleagues will do this to other students along the way.
Oh yeah.
You'll share what you just shared with them, and you'll find years later that they've taken that further than you even thought of.
Yeah, took it
It's,
differently. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. I think clients too. Like this is what we were saying before. It's like what we say.
yeah,
I'm always amazed by how I think I might say something extremely helpful to a client and it doesn't really hit. But some kind of throwaway comment that I make,
mm-hmm.
they interpret that and that's what affects the real change. It's like not what I think will be helpful is the most helpful. You ever experienced that?
Oh, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. The third quote here, and I'm hoping this launches into a bigger discussion. The third quote was we were between semesters and I came to visit you in your office. It was just you and I should also mention that I tried to quit the program and you wouldn't let me. So that's helpful.
Well, I remember that very well. I remember
Um,
that.
so this is one of those types of conversations where we were just chatting in your office and, you had been out for a little bit because you were sick with
Mhm.
cancer and you were undergoing some treatment. And I asked you how you were doing and how you were feeling. And you said, Bryan, it was a little touch and go there for a while, but I had an experience of Christ that I would not exchange for anything. Do you remember saying that?
I don't remember saying that exactly, but I remember the experience. I remember the experience that,
Can you say more?
yeah. So you just for those people who don't have a background in this, um, over 30 years in public service and in private practice in psychology, I joined DMU in 2004. In around 2010, 2009, 2010, I suddenly, a perfectly healthy guy, uh, very active, very athletic, and all of a sudden I get these growths in my neck and realize that I've had lymphoma. And
Yeah.
so I was attacked by a very serious lymphoma and almost took my life several times. And it began 8 months of intense infusion treatment. It was 8 hours a day. I'd be in an infusion. They put you in a circle and they'd hook you up with biochemistry, and you would take these drugs. And I remember the oncologist telling me, "You're going to lose all your hair," which I was already losing it anyway, so I didn't really care that much. Uh, he said, "You're going to get very weak. You're going to lose a lot of muscle mass." And he said this in a very considerate way. And he said, maybe it's 50-50. We can get you through this, but we're going to try to get you through.
Yeah.
And so I would sit in these circles doing the infusion treatment. And I would look around, and all of these other people were so depressed, naturally, because their lives were threatened and so forth. So they would
Yeah.
be very quiet.
Yeah.
And being a group guy, I would kind of get them going a bit and get people talking. But
Yeah.
at first, the thing that kept me going was the fact that I continued to teach at
Yeah.
DMU, that Father Charles had been willingly very flexible, and I was able to get there to classes on days that I wasn't on infusion. I think in that year and a half time, I only missed 4 classes.
Well, you taught classes from the hospital bed. You were this was
I taught some
before
classes.
Zoom was popular. We were
Right,
sitting there while you were in the hospital and teaching us
right,
interpersonal theory.
yeah. And so that it gave me meaning. It gave me a special meaning. I had research I was analyzing, but at one point, um, I really got knocked for a loop, and my taken to the emergency room, and my blood white count was down to 12, which
Mm,
is I should have checked out by then.
yeah.
They were very nervous. They transfused me. I wasn't afraid. I could honestly say during that whole period, I never felt the fear of death. Uh, uh,
Why not?
Do you remember Nancy?
Yeah.
Yeah, she would say, "How are you doing? How are you feeling?" And I'd say, "Well, if I don't make it, it just means that God's given me an early vacation." And so I felt this strong sense of faith, but it was more intellectual. But that particular event, where I came very close to death, um, I can remember saying to Christ, "If you want me to go on, I will. If you're ready to receive me, that's okay." And the next day, I rallied. My
Huh.
blood started going up and so forth,
Yeah.
and I concluded, I guess he wants me to go on. And I really felt in that moment touched by God. I felt like, here I'm continuing your life, you know. Um, some of the doctors were kind of amazed, you know, but I don't know if it was a miracle, but it certainly, I felt the hand of God pushing me along. Uh,
Yeah.
there was another, I don't know if I ever told you this one humorous incident where I went into crisis again, and I was getting pretty close to checking out. And I'm sitting in the hospital, and they had me in this isolated unit because my white cells were down so low. Uh, Anybody who came near me would, be a threat.
Yeah.
And in walks Father Charles, and I was delighted to see him.
Yeah.
And he gave me last rites,
Hmm.
and I went to sleep very peacefully, gained a lot of strength, and 2 days later he shows up again. And he says, "Sign this contract. I want you to teach 2 more years."
That's funny.
Yeah,
2 days later.
yeah,
So how do you account for not feeling that fear? Where does that? I mean, a lot of people are scared of death. I mean, when
yeah,
that word cancer is a terrifying word for people.
yeah.
And for you to say you weren't scared, that's not a small deal. That's a big deal.
I can honestly say that during that whole ordeal, I never felt the fear of death, and I never. And my doctor would come to me, and he would say, "Why aren't you getting depressed? What's wrong with you?" And I would say, "I guess I'm too busy." I want. He was a wonderful man. He was a non-observant Jewish man, so he didn't
Yeah,
believe in anything, but he was a very good man. He had, you meet these people and they have virtues just as well as any Christian.
sure.
Uh, but but I never said, it's my faith, because I
Mm,
don't think he would have understood that so much. Uh,
yeah,
so I just said, I'm too busy. I have a sense of mission.
yeah,
The one time I did fear death was not because of that. I was in my small airplane, practicing what they call stalls. I don't know if you know anything about
yes, yes.
but and I was pretty,
That's when you purposely stall the plane so you can learn how to,
yeah,
if in an emergency you know how to
yeah.
turn it
So
back
you
on.
learn
Yeah,
to kind of recover from the stall. So I was
yeah,
at altitude, and I was a little bit early in my career as a pilot. So I probably shouldn't have been practicing stalls by myself without an instructor, but I decided to do it, and I went into a spin,
hmm.
and I could not break the spin. And I remember I was
Oh wow.
spinning, and I was going towards the ground very fast. And I remember thinking, if I don't get out of this spin, I'll be dead within 15 seconds or something.
Yeah.
I felt that fear, that I would crash. But fortunately, I just did the right things to break a spin, and I pulled out.
How do you account for the difference between those two contexts? One
I
you
don't
felt fear and
know.
one you
I
didn't.
think the airplane event took me by surprise.
Mm.
The illness was something I had to contemplate.
Hmm.
You had time to contemplate, and as you contemplate, then I think you have an opportunity to bring from inside yourself the
Yeah.
graces that you learn from your faith and so forth. And I found it very steadying and very supportive. Uh, whereas, in a plane, it's fright.
Yeah.
Something to go wrong. Like, oh,
Yeah.
I was thinking my
Yeah.
wife's going to be really mad at me if I crash.
If I die, I don't want to tick her off. It's so funny how you think about those you leave behind.
Right.
And it's like sometimes you keep going because you don't want, like, I
Yeah.
have a couple kids, and I mean, I want to live to be old for them more than anything, you know,
Sure.
for my
Sure.
wife more than anything.
Absolutely. That you're mentioning something that's also in my wheelhouse. I think is that the importance of generations.
Mm.
That we're losing that in our society. In former societies, generations stood in the same place, and so you had two and three and sometimes four generations.
Yeah.
And even though in the wrong circumstances that could be oppressive, in the right circumstances, it was very important. It was
Yeah.
steadying. It gave stability, especially at a time when marriages tended to stay together. The family was uh, very bonded.
Yes.
So your being around for your kids is hugely important. Uh,
Yeah.
and I mean, it's even important to the extent that you can to have grandparents around, or if not
Yes.
grandparents, then good mentors. Uh,
Yes. Yeah. I think yeah, we're in a global society now, and people are moving for jobs, and um, I don't think the same honor and respect is given to parents that
yeah,
we customarily did historically. Um, I think a lot of people in this generation are probably, with the incorporation of psychology, are at least more consciously angry and upset with their parents. Right? There's so much tension between adults and their, like geriatric parents, as they
yeah,
come to, they start to develop their own individual lives, their own autonomy, their own new attachment with spouses and friends, and then they don't need their parents in the same way emotionally anymore, and that frees
yeah,
them up to explore all the ways they were hurt through original sin as a
right,
child, and then this creates this tension.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's unfortunate. I think that's another thing that's been lost. Uh, I don't know if it's exclusive to my generation, but I don't, and maybe my socioeconomic status, because I grew up in very modest circumstances. My parents were very modest people, but I can
Yeah.
remember being disciplined by my dad for good reason from time to time. But I never resented him or hated him. I didn't like it. I
Hmm.
didn't like to get punished, but I realized how hard life. It was kind of like you were saying about what you see in your patients when you see suffering in your patients. It relieves you if you can say, "Gee whiz, I wonder what it would be like to be them. That must be a very difficult place to be in." I
Yes.
could feel that as a young child with
Yes.
my dad because he was a laborer and he had a high IQ.
Yeah.
uh, Bryan. He was very, very smart. I gave him the Wexler. He went to 4 years of school. I gave him the Wexler when I was practicing the Wexler. He had
Yeah.
142 IQ. And I said,
Even with all the information that you have to retain, that
yeah,
usually that's transferred through school.
yeah.
Wow.
Well, he just read the encyclopedia himself. That's all. So everybody thought he was a college graduate.
Wow.
He was an immigrant laborer, but his jobs would be so hard that I
Yeah.
would see how much he sacrificed for us. And
Yeah.
so how could you be too angry with someone who doesn't? And
Resentful.
same with my mom. Um, I think that got lost now, and I think part of it is because parents and grandparents don't stay around, and so kids don't have a chance to see.
Yeah.
There's
Well,
also something else alarming that's going on. Is they do these studies. I don't know how valid they are, but generation millennials and to a greater extent Generation Z, they don't
yeah.
want to get married. They ask
No.
them, they just don't want to, and the idea of having kids is not exciting to them.
No,
So
they
I
have
rather,
dogs.
yeah,
They have
yeah,
dogs instead. Yeah.
yeah, and that's hard for me to relate to because the most beautiful thing you can do is have a kid. You know,
Well, I think it comes from a whole generation of divorce. I remember when I was younger, there was this idea that there was such a thing as a good divorce, and it's fine. It'll be fine for the kids. It was amicable. The parents got along, and we shared time. There's no such thing as a good divorce. On some level, even if everyone is getting along with everyone, you learn about the nature of love from your parents. So you can learn love ends if your parents split up. There's so many unconscious messages that occur during childhood.
right.
And so when it's a whole generation of kids who see all this divorce, all this infidelity, all like just the destruction of the family, it's actually, divorce rates are going down, but it's only because people aren't getting married in the first place.
Right, right.
You know,
Or getting married much later.
yeah, getting married later, and then
Yeah,
you can have less kids as a result because the
yeah.
biological clock with
It's
women.
it's alarming. Like in countries that were traditionally very Catholic, like France.
Yeah.
I, I'm interested in obviously in Italian culture,
Hmm.
but also in French culture. I love French culture.
Yeah.
I think they've contributed so much to the world. They've learned the language along with Italian. But the French, nobody gets married in France anymore. It's
Mm.
sad. It's hardly
Paris is
anyone gets married.
Paris is the city of love.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Italy is kind of holding at least with marriage, not necessarily. And I think they continue to identify with being Catholic by and
Yeah.
large, but
Yeah.
sometimes it's just pro forma Catholicism.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Nominal Catholicism.
yeah.
Now, I want to go back to something you said before about your parents and how hard your father worked
Hmm.
and your mother worked, and you were never resentful of that because you saw that that was the way in which they provided and expressed love in a certain sense. There was a book that came out not too long ago. It was called Bad Therapy. I don't know. Have you heard of this book, Bad Therapy?
No, I have not.
It was written by a journalist who is critiquing an entire generation of parenting, essentially. And she talked about how the Gen Z and the millennials, um, I might be extrapolating a little bit here. I might be interpreting a little bit, but the idea is that there's a lot of narcissism in the younger folks today because in the absence of parenting, like say during your years, or maybe a little bit later, there's been an overcompensation of engagement by the parents with the children. And it's almost like a lot of permissive parenting,
Right,
no limitations offered. Um, they all become like little emperors. The children become like little emperors. They get whatever they want.
right,
With the affluence, they get whatever toys they want. There's no corporal punishment at all anymore. There's no physical um, discipline that goes on. Um, and the result is you have a whole generation of people who can't. I mean, it's a far cry from the great generation of World War II. It's a generation of young people that have a very low threshold for suffering and difficulty, and essentially seeing other people. They only see themselves. Do you I'm just interested to hear your commentary on that. Do you see like current generations as an overcorrection? Um, I think a lot of people would hear what you said. A lot of modern parents would hear what you said about your parents working so much and not being around. And they might think, or even psychologists or therapists might think, well, that has to disrupt attachment.
mhm.
That has to disrupt attachment. So what's your comment on these swings and how engaged to be with children, how present and how to punish, and what do you think?
Well, they worked a lot, but they also were around. And my mom, believe it or not, worked in those sweatshops that they talk about. Where
Wow.
they, it was, you have no. This generation has no idea what that was like. These women would be, 100 women on a gutted second floor building, sewing buttons and pockets on garments in 100 degrees. They
Yeah.
would pass out and sew up their fingers
Oh my
because they were
goodness.
so exhausted.
Yeah.
And so my mom would do that in the evenings, but my dad would be home in the evenings. And then
Hmm.
when he was working, she would be with us.
Right.
And when they were with us, they were very present,
Yeah.
very much so. Love that wouldn't quit. And discipline. My dad, because he was a laborer, his hands were so strong he could take an apple and break it,
Yeah.
break it in two.
Wow.
So he would never raise a hand to us because he didn't want to hurt us. But
Yeah.
he would just say things in Italian that would be threatening, and we go flying under the bed, you know, knowing that he
Yeah.
meant business. Not very often. Didn't have to discipline us very much.
You thought
Uh,
that was fine? You think that was
yeah, that
healthy for
was
your
fine.
development?
And my grandparents, my mother's parents, everybody lived in tenement houses. So we started out in the basement, in basically a one room apartment,
Hmm.
uh, next to these gigantic furnaces. My father
Yeah.
had made a little extra money shoveling the coal in the furnaces to keep the whole
Yeah.
place in heat. And my grandparents were right next door, my mother's parents. So you had their presence too. So there was all this uh, uh, support, this critical mass that keeps families together.
Yeah.
Uh, People didn't have anything, and it's amazing how much they shared. They would have
Yeah.
banquets and invite like all the neighbors.
Yeah.
How did they do that? So
Very
that
communal.
kind of gets through to you, and it gives you identity, as you probably well know. Here's my son, who's not in psychology, but is in finance. But
Yeah.
we think very much alike. We're both very math oriented. We're both really good at math, and we both like to look at patterns. And he said something to me that I never thought of that made sense. I said, I don't understand how I was the last of the silent generation. So you got Depression era, World War II parents, no nonsense parents. If
Right.
you got a job, you're lucky and work hard and be honest,
Yep.
and your word is everything. Don't tell lies.
Yep.
This kind of thing. And then the baby boomers came along, and the baby boomers were exactly what you just described, because
Yeah.
these guys were coming back from the war. They were so happy to have survived that they
Yes.
overindulged these baby boomers.
The
And then they're
kids.
the ones who got into
Yeah.
drugs
Yeah.
and all of that.
Yeah.
And so my son said, I said, how all three of you kids are close to the faith. You live good, solid lives. You gave us minor problems, never major. And he said, that's because, Dad, we were raised by your generation, and these millennials were raised by the baby boomers.
Hmm.
And so his theory is, I don't know, probably an interesting research project, that it
Yeah.
skips a generation, that each people that were solidly into basic values raised their kids that way. People
Yes.
that were indulged raised their kids with indulgence. The
Yeah.
trick for our society is to get back. You can't dispense with basic values.
No.
Uh, St. Augustine and St. Thomas talked about that.
They did. Yeah.
That they're essential. That's where the virtues come from. Good
Mhm.
habits.
Yes.
Anyway, you got me preaching here.
No. No. That's great. I asked. I asked. So I like to ask this question. What are you working on in yourself right now?
A couple of things. Some are hobbies. I learned Latin, French, and Spanish. I mean, in Italian, but I never
Yes.
learned Spanish. So I'm going to start learning Spanish. Uh, that's a
Yes.
hobby. Um, another hobby, obviously, is like sports, flying, things
Yeah.
like that. My grandkids are heavily into soccer. They just won the
Yes.
state. My grandson's team won the Virginia State Championship for 12-year-olds.
Oh,
So
nice.
in soccer,
Very cool.
it was really a nice experience for him. Um, in terms of spiritually and psychologically, I
Yeah.
continue to work with psychiatry residents and
Yeah.
supervise them. Uh, and I will continue as a professor emeritus to do some things for DMU, not very much.
Yeah.
I don't want to overwork because my wife is insisting that she see the world now that we've waited so long. Uh,
Yeah. What
but
about
what
personally? What
I'm
about
working
personally
on,
within yourself?
I'm working on. I don't know if you're familiar with Witz's article on layers of personhood
The laminate?
in the meta model. His article on the person is a good
Yeah.
article. I think
Yeah.
I told him, Paul, that's one of the best things you ever wrote.
Mm.
And what he does is he talks about the different levels of personhood,
Yeah.
and so it's worth reading. And uh, I think I can take it a step further now because where he stops, what you would expect him, he's more individually oriented. Okay,
Yes.
and so he sees the internal workings of the individual and how personhood develops and how it manifests at many levels, including the philosophical and ontological and theological levels. They're all
Yeah.
important, not just the biological, the
Yeah.
relational, and so forth.
Yeah.
What I'm working on is taking it to the next step and saying, well, yes, but we don't just operate as individuals. We're individuals that are caught in relationships. And we now
Absolutely.
have the beginnings of science talking about how networks of relationships also shape an individual. Now,
Of course.
if my grandmother were listening to that, she'd say, Filippo, everybody knows that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
You know?
exactly. Yeah.
The thing is, though, that psychology always kind of gets to things, I think, a little bit late. But I think there is a science behind it, too. So I'm
Yeah.
looking at it both mathematically and I'm looking at it, um, uh, uh, from a traditional group process point of view as well. And I
Yeah.
think I can add to that, God
Mm.
willing, if I live long enough, I think there's some things I can add to that. Part of
Are
our
you talking
identity
about
is our relationships.
yeah, yeah. Are you thinking about mirror neurons and things like that, and then the mirroring of
Yeah,
my self identity in relation to the mother figure and all those things?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Mirror neurons are God's gift to us, so that we can be relational as He created us to be. He created us
Yes.
to be relational. So Brian becomes Brian every time he loves his kids more and loves his wife more.
Yes.
He loves his patients more. You become more of who Brian is.
Yeah.
Uh, so you
Yeah.
can't look at the person in isolation. Vitz talks about a bit about relationality, and he does it very well.
Mm.
But that wasn't his bailiwick. That wasn't his wheelhouse. I think that's something I can contribute to. If I can get an outlet to publish things like that, the problem is how do you get Catholic things published?
Well,
You know,
there are ways.
yeah.
There
But
definitely are ways. Yeah, I mean, I'm reminded of Martin Buber and the I Thou, and Pope Benedict taking some of that thought and saying, I
yes,
discover myself in you. There's no me without you. Something new occurs. Some of this is Sullivan too. That like you could never really know what's inside of me, and that the moment I share it with you, what I share is filtered through your perception of me, and something new is created. It's very Trinitarian, isn't it? The
right.
Holy Spirit spirating for the
Yeah,
Father and the Son and all that.
you did very well. I think, yeah, and obviously it's not originally mine.
Yeah.
John Paul II in
Oh,
his was in his personalism,
yeah.
uh, really long. I think it went beyond Buber, who went beyond
Oh, yeah.
Frankel, beyond
Yeah.
those, and talked about for a Christian how far does that go? It goes
Yeah.
very far for a Christian.
Yes.
I'm trying to do it, bring a little bit more of the science into it by saying
Yeah.
there's also a mathematics to this that you can actually. Uh, did I lecture when you had me on Lorna Benjamin's work?
Quite a bit. I train my students in Lorna
Yeah.
Benjamin.
So I was always impressed with her intellects and how she could position people in interpersonal space. But
Yes.
she's missing something. What she's missing is a third dimension, which has to do with the way John Paul II writes about relationality. I
Oh
tried to
yeah.
do some research on that. That's why I got sick.
Hmm.
I collected a lot of data, and the data came out really well, but I never published it because
Oh.
I got really sick. So I think that needs to go further.
Oh, I would love to. I would love to read what you write on that. Well,
Yeah.
when we teach Benjamin, it stays very qualitative. I'm not doing any math, but it's
Well,
tremendously valuable to understand those interpersonal patterns and
yeah,
how we react to how people treat us and how it's predictable. You can predict it on a graph, and
yeah.
that's how I treat myself. And it's really fascinating, high level stuff.
And then she touches a little bit on how that affects the identity, but not as well as
Yeah.
it could be.
Yeah.
Anyway, I am so excited about what you're doing, what Greg is doing. And then we have Andrew Sodergren down in Cincinnati, who's doing some really magnificent work, and
Yeah.
so keep it up. Keep
It's
it up.
great. Well, listen, it's been so awesome having you on the show, and it's such a treat. And
Yeah,
I'm so deeply indebted to your training, and I
this
know
was a
I know
treat
you.
for me. This was a
Yeah,
treat for me.
I know you started off with when you started off at DMU that nobody was really professionally integrating psychology and spirituality. So hopefully you're able to see the fruit of some of those early growing pains and labor that you've put in.
I think we do. I think Nordling and we talk about that, and it needs to keep happening.
Definitely. Well, thanks for coming on.
Okay, thank you for having me.